This lesson will be reviewing fractions in simplest form. You will have one objective today, and that is to write each fraction in simplest form. The first thing you need to know about simplest form is finding the greatest common factor. Question is, what is the greatest common factor? The greatest common factor can be defined by the following. It is the biggest shared factor between two numbers. It is always helpful to find the greatest common factor when wanting to simplify fractions. So, going back to my previous slide, you saw a fraction that said 4 over 8. The greatest common factor would be the biggest number that goes into 4, that also goes into 8. Let's first practice finding the greatest common factor. Let's say that I'm giving you two numbers, 6 and 12. I would go ahead and start by finding the factors of both 6 and 12. To do that, you can do the rainbow method, which is one thing that we've started talking about in class. I know that 1 and 6 are factors, and also 2 and 3. When doing a rainbow for 12, I know 1 and 12 are factors, 2 and 6, and finally 3 and 4. Next, I'm going to look at the common factors that I have between 6 and 12. I see that both numbers have factors 1, 2, 3, and 6. The greatest common factor is going to be the biggest number they have in common, so that would mean that 6 would be considered my greatest common factor between 6 and 12. Some students have an easier time writing and trying to find the greatest common factor when looking at it in a fraction format. So you can see down below, I wrote the fraction 6/12. In this case, once again, I'm just looking to find the biggest number that can go into 6, that can also go into 12. Hopefully, it's pretty easy to spot out this way that 6 is a number that can go into itself, and it can also go into 12. So I'm going to take 6 and divide it by 6, and then take my denominator of 12 and divide it by 6 also. Whatever you do to the top, you must also do to the bottom when you are simplifying a fraction. So for my answer, 6 divided by 6 is 1, and 12 divided by 6 is 2. I know that my fraction is simplified because there are no other numbers that I could use to reduce this fraction of 1/2. Both 1 and 2 are prime numbers, and if that's the case, then you know that you are going to be done. Once again, sometimes it is helpful to picture a fraction when finding the greatest common factor of two numbers. So say, for example, I'm taking the numbers 8 and 10. Well, if I were to write this as a fraction of 8 over 10, I can first decide, well, I know that at least 2 is a fraction, or 2 is a number that can go into 8, and it can also go into 10 because both 8 and 10 are even numbers. So I'm going to go ahead and divide both the top and the bottom by 2. 8 divided by 2 is 4. 10 divided by 2 is 5. There are no other numbers that can go into 4 and 5. So I've already simplified my fraction, but by doing that, I've also already figured out that the greatest common factor of 8 and 10 must be 2. So now that you know how to find the greatest common factor, it's time to simplify. Once again, I'm looking to find the biggest factor that can go into my numerator of 3. That also goes into my denominator of 15. So in this case, it's always first smart to try either a 2 or a 3 because that's what my numerator looks like. 2 is definitely not a factor of 3, so that's kind of a silly answer. So let's look at seeing if we can divide both 3 and 15 by 3. Going to divide the top by 3, and then also the bottom by 3. And luckily, using my rules for divisibility, I know that 15 is divisible by 3 because I can add up 1 and 5 to equal, that's a 5, to equal 6, and 6 is divisible by 3. You should also know from a fact family that 15 divided by 3 is 5. And then your numerator is going to be 3 divided by 3, which is 1. So I know that 3 would be my greatest common factor. That goes into both 3 and 15, making my simplified fraction 1/5. And then I am done. So here's a question I want you to do on your own. This is not a practice problem, but go ahead and see if you can figure this out on your own before I start to explain it. In this case, using my rules of divisibility, if a number ends in both a 5 and a 0, I know that 5 is going to be a factor. So I'm going to go ahead and divide both the top and the bottom by 5. 25 divided by 5 is 5. 50 divided by 5 is 10. And looking at this, I can kind of see that my fraction's not simplified yet. 5/10 still has another factor that goes into both 5 and 10. And I can spot that out right away because I can also keep dividing this fraction by 5. So I'm going to do it one more time to get the answer 1/2. And I know that 1/2 is my simplest form because you can't break it down anymore. So the question is, what was my greatest common factor? Because it certainly wasn't 5 because I didn't find the simplest form the first time. I had to take 2 steps of doing that. Well, to find your greatest common factor this time, because we divided by 5 the first time and then 5 the second time, if you were to multiply those two numbers together, it would be 25. So what I could have initially done was figured out that 25 is my greatest common factor. So if I were to divide my initial fraction of 25/50ths by 25, I would straight away get to 1/2. So once again, simplest form is 1/2, but the greatest common factor between 25 and 50 was actually 25. Practice problem number 1, simplify. Feel free to pause. Hopefully in this case, whether or not you decide to do a rainbow method or just guess and check by trying different factors that go into 9 and 27, that you realize by now that the greatest common factor of 9 and 27 is in fact 9. 9 goes into itself and it also goes into 27. 9 divided by 9 is 1. 27 divided by 9 is 3. So your answer is 1/3. If you got the answer 3/9, you probably divided by the number 3. And if that's the case, I hope you took it one step further by dividing 3 again on both the top and the bottom to get the answer of 1/3. Practice problem number 2, simplify. Feel free to pause. In this case, your greatest common factor is going to be 3. 3 is a factor of 9, and it's also a factor of 15. 9 divided by 3 is 3. 15 divided by 3 is 5. I'm going to double check and just make sure if this is the most reduced fraction that I can make. But as I look here, there's no other number besides 1 that can go into 3 or 5. So I know that 3/5 is going to be the simplest form. If you have a question on simplifying fractions, make sure you write it on your notes paper and write a smiley face on how you feel about today's lesson. Thanks.